Got ourselves a batch of shinies, Commander.
Welcome to episode 8 of Coordinated Fire, a Star Wars Shatterpoint podcast where we choke in the top cut just like the Leafs do. How's it going, Titus?
Good. So we are missing Sean this week. He's having some technical difficulties back home, but it's
We are. His computer decided to pull a Padme.
Yeah, that's a way to put it. Oh, that's morbid.
Sometimes you gotta die a big sad. I don't know what to tell you.
I guess so. So
we had an event this weekend.
We had a very busy weekend.
We did. We have a ton of games to talk about. So we had a local event out at Critical Hit. 7 players came out. It was awesome to see everybody jam some games. Due to, a bit of a lower turnout, we did decide to do open lists because we've all had things on the agenda to practice with. So we did pairings. We did a 4-round event, but we just went in with open lists, play what you want each round. I think that landed well. Titus, I know you still played a premier list throughout.
I like having that practice of having to pick my list and see what my opponent's playing and make a decision. So anytime I get the chance to play, I usually bring a premier list, even if it's like a 1 game a night kind of thing.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that is good practice to have. And honestly, that's probably something we're going to touch on a little later. But let's dive into some of those games played. Titus, I'll pass it over to you first. You did go the premier route for the event, so what did that list look like?
So, I was building off of my Cassian Moff list that I've been playing quite a bit recently. So I had Cassian with Lobot, and this time I took the Commandos with him because it worked better with the anchor. Then Moff had Ezra and Fifth Brother because Moff is the one who really wants the tiebreakers in how I was playing it anyway. So that list stayed the same, just kind of swapped the supports. I dropped the Dark Troopers because the Commandos seem a little bit better now, at least into what we're playing against.
Yeah, I can say, and spoiler alert, we did get a game in, and I had another game against Cassian with the Commandos, and wow, does he elevate them.
Oh, yeah. So then my third squad was, I had Princess Leia with Luke Skywalker as her secondary and Rebel Pathfinders. So that squad was playing a point down, but I really liked the spy synergy, and Rebel Pathfinders are blisteringly fast with Leia. Just being able to, off the bat, turn all the dashes she gives them into advances means you can swing across the board and take your opponent's back point before they even activate. And that's amazing.
Yeah, we've talked before, I think she is the best spot for the Pathfinders. She just enables what they want to do so well, especially handing out some hunkers.
Making sure they stayed hunker is very important.
Is huge. I do think playing a point down instead of looking at Han and Chewie is a little bold, but
yeah, I mean,
we all make
I
our
talk
choices
about this all the time. I don't particularly like Han and Chewie. I recognize they are powerful. It's not my cup of tea. The final squad I had was Ahsoka Jedi No More with Jango Fett and the Bounty Hunters. That pairing is mostly just Cassian with Ahsoka is a power trip because when someone wins you, you can double advance and get to them pretty much anywhere on the table, and she hits real hard if she stays in Jarkai. So regularly it's, you wounded something, well, here have 3 dice and a disarm, and often 6 dice and a damage and a disarm, And then Jango and the Bounty Hunters, I've just been kind of rotating through stuff that I think would be interesting in that spot.
Yeah, you did Wrecker with Weak Ways last time?
Yep. Yeah, so on our Thursday game, I did Wrecker with the Weak Ways. I didn't like Wrecker's relative lack of mobility. The Weak Ways are great. I'm probably going to go back to them. But Jango and the Bounty Hunters, I find synergize well with Lobot, and he's in my anchor, so let's give it a shot. But yeah, that's what I was playing. I played 3 games because I got the round 1 bye. So I had a game against Kyle, a game against Sean, and a game against Matt. But yeah, it was a good day, all in all. I played it against... Sean's always playing Empire. Matt had Mandalorians, and Kyle had Republic. And so it was a good survey of what the current meta holds.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that you went from a bye into our game. Is that the order?
Yeah, it was.
Okay, so our game was your first game.
Yeah, I spent the first 2 hours of the morning playing Hearthstone and spectating games, and then I played Kyle immediately.
And watching Rogue One, which we had on in the background.
Yeah, that was real cool, actually. I think we got through all of the prequel trilogy as well by the end of the day.
Yeah, we did.
So it was a fun time.
So my round 2 game, Titus's round 2 game, we were paired together. Titus, you played the Moth pairing.
Because I knew it was something you wanted to practice. You've been vocal about that on air.
It was. It makes me nervous. And guess what, Titus? You won.
I did.
It was a good game. It was actually a really good game. You ended up taking it 2-0. But this was close. And I think, and you and I discussed, this was you and I going back and forth until someone made a mistake. And that person was me.
It really was. Struggle 1 was a slog.
Yeah, so I played, because lists are important, I played Kamikin, so pretty standard affair of Cam, Shakti, and the first with Anakin, Snips, and the ARFs.
And it's still a good list. It's a very good list.
This actually sold me more on it than I think I had been previously.
Yeah, like this was scary to play against. I'm not gonna lie. Anakin just comes across the board, and once he gets into your back line, all bets are off. He kills things. It's what he does.
Yeah, so we played on Sabotage here, which was my call for the list, and I think this was a good learning game for me on why Sabotage might not be the best place for Anakin, and it's not because of Anakin, but into revenge style lists, especially with your style, with tiebreakers and lockdown and all the things that scare me at night. I think that the distance between objectives means I have some risks on those wounds that I need to be getting to do the Anakin thing.
It also has a bit of a deterrent built in to sending Anakin to the center of the table, which is where I think he is the best placed, because in shifting you go to the center every time. I mean, Anakin isn't necessarily the one going to the center, but you know what I mean. You're going to the midline and there's a center point, so he's not wasted going there. Whereas with Sabotage, he will go to one side on his way to your opponent's side of the table, and it gives your opponent the opportunity to just go, well, if Anakin's there, I'm going to the other side where he can't reach me.
And that is exactly what you did. You gave me your supports on the Anakin side, which Anakin shoot through, but that doesn't trigger all the fun Anakin bits. And you kept, at least for the majority of Struggle 1, kept any of the stuff I wanted to be hunting far enough away. And Sabotage allows you to at least get some comfortable scoring with your back points.
Yes. And
again, you played to that very well. I had a pretty solid early lead in Struggle 1.
Yeah, but once Fifth Brother gets into your back line, points aren't safe anymore.
Points aren't safe anymore.
And that was really a big factor in changing the game around. Was Fifth Brother sneaked past Anakin, got to the back, and just started bopping back and forth between your back points. And when everything is moving up to try to take the middle, suddenly those back points, that one support you leave behind, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and add into that a very early Anakin wound, which led to me being more constrained on force than I would have liked. And I think, and we'll get to talking about this when we get into some of the meta conversations, but you spent most of Struggle 1 dealing with Anakin, which goes to show the power of what Anakin's bringing to my side. But the Rebel Commandos were able to get an early wound on your Shatterpoint with the Cassian Shatterpoint ability, along with their own focus. We're able to get an early Anakin wound, which is kind of what started the pushback to your direction. Anakin woke up and was real mad, but
he just started killing.
You left him pinned and disarmed, and it took me until I could clear that disarm before it was worth waking Anakin back up. I think Anakin stayed in reserve for for quite some time, both struggles.
And especially with Moff, that really hurts, having to spend 2 Force to reserve.
Yeah, so as a wounded Anakin, I had a reserve tax to pay. Force was tight.
So let's quickly touch on some of the other games. I played Cassian PLC against Sean playing his Moff Thrawn list. So it was a bit of a grudge match. It went long and it was a very tight game, like very technical. We went to struggle 3. Sean eventually took it, but it was very back and forth the whole time. And I will say, Moff is still such a pain to face with Cassian because you never feel like you can reserve. When you have 5 Force, no refresh, 2 Force is a lot. And it definitely led to some bad activations on my part.
Yeah, Moff. Turns out Moff is still good, at least impactful.
Yes. Depends on the list.
Yeah,
sure.
I don't think it matters how much force you have, though. A 2 force reserve cost is most of the time means you just can't do it.
Yeah. And then my final match against Matt, he was playing Maul Armor with Gar Saxon and Clan Kryze, and Armor had Bo-Katan with the Coverts. Pretty standard fare there. And that was the one where I played Cassian and Ahsoka, and like I said, it was a real power trip because, he came in swinging fairly early, and Ahsoka just started annihilating things. I think Armor, Clan Kryze, and the Coverts were down by the time I got to my 3rd or 4th activation. She just started chewing through everything. And I lost both my supports in the process, but it felt like it hurt him a lot more. I think part of that was my supports were getting killed in deployment by and large.
Okay.
So then they get to wake up and his don't.
Yeah, I think you and I have both been very high on Ahsoka Jedi No More. I think post rebalance, she is incredible. And honestly, right now her Longshanks win rate is reflecting that, and yet we're still not seeing her a lot at events.
No, and like most of the time when she shows up, she's like getting real high in the standings, but that'll be the only player playing her.
Yeah,
it's weird.
And I think she absolutely has her place in Mandalorian lists. But to your point, Cassian enables her in some really interesting ways. I have had some pretty good success with her in Republic. So let's jump into some of my lists and games. So I went through the backlog of Republic lists I wanted to get on the table and start testing, including my Thursday game. So my Thursday game, I played Kenobi, X, and the Commandos with Ahsoka, Crosshair, and the 212th. And this Ahsoka Crosshair 212th is kind of what I've landed on with her in a Republic list. I think, you put Crosshair out there, he does the thing, he's going to move a lot and get to a point. And just having that threat with Ahsoka of, you can wound him, but I'm going to get to do a thing, which isn't something Republic has had at least good access to. And then the 212th are just have been my favorite clone unit since the rebalance, and been really, really happy with them, especially in a Kenobi list where they stay alive a little easier. This game was into Iden, Grand Inquisitor, and Ahsoka did Ahsoka's job. I'll admit to some hot rolling on defense here, but there was a couple situations where there was a pretty big cluster on a midpoint. And Ahsoka's range 2 free expertise is really, really good, especially even just on the clone dice. I can't think of how many times I've rolled 2 expertise and been like, that converts to 1, and it's just getting an extra block in there, which goes a long way, especially into, a slightly downshifted Iden and ISF. This was just, list felt tanky, list felt great. And really, really happy with Crosshair. Played Crosshair a couple times this week. And he does his job. He pings the damage, kills the support. That's Crosshair's job.
Crosshairs. There's not always the space in a Republic Premiere because we have so many good secondaries, but Crosshair just is very reliable in what he does.
Yeah, and I really liked him in the mirror match. I like him in the Rebel Commandos. Any list that I just feel like I need to be able to ping supports, and it's going to put some restraint on the opponent's force or their ability to do, what they're trying to do. Crosshair's been amazing.
He's useful when your opponent has a high priority target that you just need to take out. And that's very thematic. So I love that for him.
And he does it. I was able to Shatterpoint him and just finish off that unit with a trick shot and then go do something else. And that happened twice in total in the 3 games I played with Crosshair, and I Shatterpoint him a lot.
Anytime you can get a kill with a trick shot, it feels amazing.
Yeah, and this is something that Republic isn't always having the easiest time to do is those confirmed wounds, right? Anakin notwithstanding. Yes. So the next on the test list for me was Kenobi Cam. So Kenobi Rex to 12th with Kiadi-Mundi, Shakti, and the Fighters. This is what I played into Josh, who was playing Cassian and Freedom Fighter. Frankly, I was a little nervous about Freedom Fighter going into this matchup. Coordinated Fire Exposed takes a lot of the benefits of those hunkers and says, no, most of these results are fails.
Yeah, Leia can really put a hurt on given that coordinated fire.
Yeah, and we saw that, and Josh actually played Freedom Fighter very well in keeping her kind of just away from the Kiadis and Obi, and just not keeping her not in a place that like, oh, I need to send someone here. So it just was never the right time to put a wound on her. I actually really like this list. There's so many times that Kiadi or Shakti can't quite get to where you need them to get them into melee range. Being able to take cover, get them onto that point, and then either force push or force repulse happened more than I thought it would, and kind of just extended their reach with that take cover action as part of that walk. And Shakti is surprisingly tanky compared to what she normally is when she's hunkered up.
Yeah, that knowledge and defense just always makes Republic stuff do. It's a force multiplier. Like, they just do so much more. Like, they're more reliable. They move around a lot more. It's...
Yeah, like, Titus, you and I both played a lot of Kenobi. And when this list first started kind of making its rounds, both you and I leaned pretty quickly into that's probably not the best pairing for either of them.
Yeah, that was my opinion, too. I think it's still my opinion. I think Kenobi has other partners he would prefer to be with. I think Cam does as well. I think it's a perfectly functional list. I just don't think you're getting full usage out of both of them. But I gather that you have a different opinion.
Do I think it's the best Cam pairing? No, I don't. But do I think it's one that fit me a little better? Yes.
Okay.
And I played Cam Invader for a while. I've been playing the Kamikin games to get up on what this does and doesn't do. But I just lean to a more defensive playstyle. Having to rely on wounding things is not the direction I typically want to lean. In fact, I actually really want to try Kenobi Cam into your Cassian Moff list.
I'm interested.
And let's run it. You're in the same boat with that list. We're like, I don't have to attack. I don't have to do that at all. But I think the combination of, the ability to hold a point with the displacement might be more the direction I'm looking for. Our game was next, and honestly, I was really happy with Anakin. Exactly what I'm nervous about with Anakin is exactly what happened, and I think you went in with a lot of intention on this is how I deal with Anakin.
Yeah. It's nice in terms of, it felt like with Iden, a lot of the counters were very much in list building. Whereas with Anakin, a lot of the counterplay feels like it's...
counterplay.
Yeah, it's in-game decisions. Obviously, list that is better equipped to make those decisions is going to do better, but it still feels like it's not being decided in turn 0.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, there were some points in this game where I was really sold on this list, and that is because I had a couple turns where Anakin popped off and did the Anakin thing.
For sure.
Like, he, throughout the game, wounded the Commandos, wounded Lobot, wounded Cassian. He was doing stuff, and when he got to your backline where Cassian and Lobot was when this game got really tight.
Yep. And I think it's important to keep in mind, and like this is something we're going to touch on a little bit later, but counterplay doesn't mean hard counter. It just means it gives you a chance. So like Anakin, yeah, you can learn how to play around him. He's still going to come for you, and he's still going to decimate your list. It's just a matter of how do you handle that.
Yeah, there was one point in Struggle 1 where I had kind of fallen back in the struggle a bit, and in one Anakin turn, I think I flipped 4 points.
You would have flipped every point, except I got the Cassian revenge and shuffled some stuff around and was able to hold on to two. But like it was
Yep.
it could have been bad.
It's an interesting matchup for sure. You and I both commented a couple times during this that like, wow, we force each other into some really awful decision making. And that's what, again, this Cassian Moff does. It is very mentally taxing to be across the table from. Because every time you're wounding something, you have to look at every single unit. You know, with the standard revenge trigger, it's, you know, with Kanan, it's what can Kanan do if I wound something? What can Leia do if I wound something? What can Mando do if I wound something? With Cassian, it's I have to analyze the whole board and what is the total of what Titus can do if I wound something here. And one of those times getting me by surprise is what closed this game off. I just need more practice.
Yep. Of course. It's always the answer.
So next game, so I was just going again, getting through that backlog of Republic matchups I wanted to play. So the next one here was Ahsoka, Crosshair 2/12 again, this time with Hunter, Wolf, and the Wolf Pack. When I played this into Obi Annie, which first and foremost is probably not the matchup I want this into. There were some things I really liked about this list and some things I didn't. Crosshair helps into Obi, which did go in my favor there. Wolf with the units in this list just
especially when you're bringing Crosshair and the 212, that's all that expertise is crits.
Honestly,
like,
and Wolfpack.
Oh yeah, I guess their expertise did get a little touch up, didn't it?
The Wolfpack melee expertise is incredible.
Yeah, I had forgotten all about that.
And this was, I think, my third or fourth time getting Wolfpack on the table. And wow, if they had defensive maneuver, they would be in every Obi list I've ever made. They don't, so they're not.
Yeah, I've liked Wolfpack for a long time. I think they got a little left behind in terms of they didn't get an extra hit point, everyone else did. So like their defining feature used to be that they were the tough clones, and now they're not. But melee clones is still an interesting niche, especially when they're carrying sniper rifles.
1 expertise is a crit, 2 is a crit and a hit, and 3 is 2 crits.
Yeah, that's phenomenal.
And they're rolling, when you're getting Pack Hunter and they're run and gun, that's 9 dice.
That's real good.
I have been very impressed. And anytime I'm not, if I have a 4-cost slot and I'm not running Kenobi, which is 2 conditions that aren't met very frequently, I'm impressed. What I will say here, and this is a couple games now where I think I really need to look at this, I was not impressed with Hunter. He felt fine. The dice fixing across the rest of the list was the value, and there is a lot of value there, so I'm not underplaying that. But Hunter's activations don't feel like what they used to. And I'm of the opinion that the ARFs losing Coordinated Fire Expose hit Hunter the worst.
Yeah, we were talking about that previously, and he really relies on getting those attacks through a lot more than I think we realized, because it was always one of those things where it's like, oh, Hunter's more of a movement and control kind of character, but it was just he wasn't doing a ton of damage, but he was still getting a lot through on his tree, like shoves and movement, and those are really key.
Yeah, I was hitting 2 to 3 successes.
Yeah.
Into
That's
really any target. It's not enough for, a primary that has 9 health, because I can tell you he's a liability into Anakin.
Yeah, I feel like it was also just a bad matchup. I would want to get him on the table a few more times into stuff that he'd be better into.
Yeah, I do think definitively this is probably my Hunter list.
I really like this list. I want to try it.
I would consider swapping Ahsoka for Luminara here, because I think I walked out of this game with 6 wounds, and that's into a Kenobi list.
Yeah, they're both really good in this list. I think that's really the only other character you would consider in that spot.
Kit would be the other one.
Yeah, Kit could be interesting. Supporting Fire Dash is very useful on the Wolf Pack, especially.
It's the 212th actually that sell me on it.
Yeah, I mean, both are
because
good options.
That would allow me to defensive maneuver, focus, dash to where I want.
I like it with the Wolf Pack because it allows you to turn on Pack Hunter on the second attack.
Yes. And I've definitely done that with ARFs on the other side before. Last list was a Kenobi Mace, playing into Sean, playing Krennic GI. This game started off with, we both flipped Shatterpoint and as our starting card, and mine allowed me to get Mace. We played on odds, and we got the X, which was my best case scenario by a large margin.
Mace in the center on the X is amazing.
And that is where that game ended. Mace stood there and wounded Four Sister as he got on the point as the short answer. Mace on the center point, and then for struggle 2, we got the one that's both center points and then one on the side. So I don't think Sean got an attack in the entire game that didn't have protection and steadfast.
Yeah. That makes a major difference.
Yes, it was a very good Mace game. So that was our buttload of games that we got over the last bit. So for our main topic of the week, we're not doing a primary of the week. Titus and I just wanted to chat after getting a bunch of games in, and talk about some general game tactics and countering, the current meta that we find ourselves in. So jumping into some general play strategy, one thing I wanted to talk about is just playing in tournaments and planning your turns. Every game in an event is a game with 1v1, a person against a person, but also 2 players playing against the clock. I think it is no secret that nobody likes how end of time works in Shatterpoint.
No, it's awful. It's awful.
Also think that there is no consensus on what would be a better answer, because that is a very difficult question and up for game designers to figure out and not us.
Yep, it's not changing, so we may as well just deal with what we have.
It's not changing, and I'm actually more on board with Mission Critical than I think most are, because I prefer the concept of a mechanic that forces a game to come to a conclusion.
I don't think Mission Critical is most people's problems. It's when you get past it that's the problem.
Yeah, it's when you end in time. So I want to talk about a couple things you can do to make sure a game gets through, even if you're going to your first event, if you're maybe newer to your list and figuring some stuff out, you're playing a few squads that you've never played before. All those things can add a little bit of time. So first thing I want to talk about is just keeping your stuff organized. And I have fallen into this trap before, and having open lists of this event actually made this top of mind for me because I was swapping them out between rounds. Have tools to organize your stuff. And whether that is cases to hold your minis, that is a token organizer, that is card organizers, whatever it is, those things can really help just get the game started.
Don't be like me. For the longest time, I just used the plastic bags that came with the game, and eventually I had one of our local guys, Dave, went out to the dollar store, bought me one of those little tackle boxes, and came into one of our tournaments and said, "Here, I got you this. Stop using those bags."
It's important.
Yeah.
Keep your stuff ordered. It helps clean up post game. It helps set up for new game. The other thing is, especially with Premier, part of the decision making is choosing your list, but have some ideas going in of what you would take into certain matchups and certain pairings. And we'll talk about that when we get into countering the meta and what some of those good options are. But I think have a plan for your Premier list. I think there's some pretty common stuff that you're going to run into, and especially different list archetypes. Have a plan of what you would take into certain things. Every table you walk up to shouldn't be brand new thought process on what would I take into this list.
And you can build your list in any number of ways. Like, you can build your Premier to have a plan for each mission. You can build your Premier to have a plan for certain things you might face. You can even just build your Premier to go, okay, this is my jumpy team that deals with really like a dense terrain with a lot of elevation, and this is my team that deals with flat ground. The important thing is to have a plan.
Yeah.
So that your decision making goes quicker and you're not eating into your game time with looking at the terrain, looking at your opponent and going, what actually would be better here? You should know ahead of time fairly well.
Yeah, and sometimes that plan is a 2v2 list where your plan is, I'm going to play this one list once and then I'm going to play this for the rest of the day, which has actually been a really common thing we're seeing at high-level events. Next up, once lists are chosen, this is what I'm playing, this is what you're playing. Roll your dice immediately.
Yes. Before you start setting anything up, roll the dice.
Roll the dice.
If your opponent wins and decides they want to switch sides of the table, you don't have to pack everything back up.
that also allows, if one person sets up faster, they can start setting up the objective markers. It just allows a clean flow. But you're right, you don't want to have everything set up and then realize you have to swap.
The other thing I would mention is once the first primary has been placed, you will generally have a good idea of how placement is going to end up, especially on missions where you have to set up at a certain spot. So unless your whole plan is based around, I want to line up exactly right across from this specific unit, just start placing everything. Like, it saves time, and I mean, obviously check with your opponent, but it's just way easier to get everything down because you have an idea of where everything's going to be as soon as that first primary hits the table.
Yeah, most of deployment in Shatterpoint is based on the mission. You take your home objectives and get the game rolling. Once you're in the game, I think first and foremost, having some practice with your list is generally advised. I know that's not always reality in a lot of cases, and this isn't to deter someone to going to an event as a new player, because you should absolutely do that. And the best Shatterpoint you're going to get is in a day where you can get 3 to 4 games in at an event. But plan your turns. And what I mean by that is, your order deck. The further you get through your order deck, the more limited the options could be on what you would flip. Your opponent's going to have some decision making to do in their turn. That's going to take them some time. During that time, examine the board and look at where your units are. And hey, if I flip this, this is what I would do. If I flip this, this is what I would do. The first time you're thinking about what you would do with a unit should not be when you flip their card. Yeah. And I think that is a responsibility of both players at the table, because there are some decisions during turns that are going to take some time, and that is totally okay. That is expected, especially at high level play, especially against a skilled opponent. There is going to be some tough choices that have to be made, and you want to give your opponent that time to do that. And I am never against that. But while they're doing that, take a look at the board state. And if I flip this, this is what I would do. If I flip this, this is what I would do. Hey, I think going into the flip, this is the best thing I could be flipping right now. Because if you already know that, you already know what you're shatterpointing if the card you're flipping is Shatterpoint. Those are going to speed up the game a lot, and those decisions on what am I going to activate can be some of the longest that people hold on to. Am I going to reserve this or not? And if you have a plan for what you have, those decisions go a lot faster. And again, especially later in your order deck.
Uh-huh.
And that's actually one of, as even before this point, piece of advice, know what's left in your order deck. Pay attention to what you have left. And that's going to help you make better decisions with your out of activation movement, because you want to set up your next turns to be better turns.
Yep. And don't be ashamed of using reminders for things. So like you mentioned, keep in mind what's in your order deck. Josh has a set of tokens he printed out that is literally just a set of numbers and then an extra one for the Shatterpoint, and that he puts on the character cards that shows which has gone and when they went, so that he can just look at his characters and go, okay, this is what's left, rather than having to look through his discard pile and figure all that out.
Yeah, and I love that.
And another interesting thing you could do is have tokens to just remind you of different triggers. I mean, right on the cards, there is the tactic symbol on an activation card that has a tactic. You can take that to another extent where, for example, I put a token on top of the struggle, like the next struggle card, to remember my Cassian trigger, because it's not a common trigger that I want to remember that when the struggle changes, that trigger happens. So little things like that, don't be afraid to use physical reminders of things, because that will help shortcut that process. You don't need to think about it because you have a physical thing there reminding you of it.
Yeah, and anytime you're going to use something like that, talk it through with your opponent, just to get a check that, hey, I'm putting this token here, this is what it's for. Because I think that communication with your opponent is always important. Yeah. But yeah, those can be great things, especially as you're learning and as you need those reminders. That is totally okay. You're playing at a local event, and this is something that I have lived by in every competitive type of game that I've ever played. If I know my opponent's list well, I'm going to remind them of triggers. And for nothing else other than this keeps the game moving quickly and has a clean game. last way I want to win is because my opponent forgot something. That's not the intent. Now, for optional abilities, that's different. I don't know why someone's choosing or not choosing to do something, but like, you're never going to choose to not do a revenge trigger.
On a similar note, don't be that guy who, if your opponent says, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and do a coordinated fire and then attack, and proceeds to go through his turn, does the movement he needs, then goes straight to attacking. Don't be that guy who goes, oh, you can't coordinated fire, you already picked up your dice. Because they already said that they were going to do it, and we're trying to play quickly. Obviously, if you get halfway through the next activation, that's a little bit past the point, but if they stated outright they were going to do this, don't be the guy who goes, oh, you didn't say it at the right time.
But you actually come up with a good point there. When making actions, express your intent. As you start moving that character, as you start going through the flow, if you communicate with your opponent, I'm going to do this move here, hit this ingress, and then I'm going to attack, and I'm going to coordinated fire. If there is an issue with that flow of actions, your opponent will most likely say it there. Communicate your intent.
Yep. And along the lines of communicating the intent, if you are measuring for a specific range or something, confirm it with your opponent. Because even if there's no argument then, say 3 turns down the line and say your Krennic has been bumped by someone kicking the table or something, you can look back on that moment and go, hey, you agreed this was range 3 from this other character, or this was range 2 of this objective. They can't say, oh, well, it's not there now, because it wouldn't have been legal for you to move it.
Models get nudged. Tokens, objective tokens get moved sometimes. This is the reality of tabletop games.
Mm-hmm.
The state of the game is not always going to be perfect. But yes, if you play with intent and express that intent, it can be, you're right, you can go back on those moments and say, the only way I flip this objective is by this character being on it. So how could they not be on it now? They haven't.
Yeah, you always communicate with your opponent. That's the biggest thing I always hammer in on. Communicate everything, even if it feels like too much.
I think this is a good transition into talking about playing into the current meta post rebalance. And I think Kiadi Anakin is definitely one that's been frequently talked about as one of the top lists. We've seen a few wins coming out of Cam specifically, because I think there's a few pairings that we've seen at top tables, but this seems to be the big bad.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what's winning events right now and what's doing well. So touching a bit on what is the game plan for a Kiadi Anakin list? And that is, you're going to leverage Anakin for big swings, to wounding a primary or secondary of your opponents, for Anakin to be able to ideally move that struggle tracker if it's a primary, but at the very least get to move basically the entire list a dash with his identity. That is core thing to the list, and Cam's identity is going to help with that, right? Because that's getting on wound, getting a heal, and another dash. So this list is moving all over the place the moment Anakin hits something with a lightsaber. The other part is the Cam side, which includes Kiadi and Shakti, both of which have excellent displacement abilities.
And a force discount, because they play very much into that side of the force economy where they want to, they can do whatever they want because they're very rarely going to run out of force.
Yeah, the list has 8 force. It has discount. Anakin's got some force refresh, although he's typically going to spend more than he's refreshing. But that's the baseline. So, Titus, how are we playing into this list?
So in the meta that we just came out of before the rebalance, the prevailing wisdom was that a lot of the big bad things you're playing into, you have to plan for in list building. And while that does really help here, I find there is a lot more you can do into the current big meta threats on the table. That's not to say any list can just do whatever they want against these guys, but there's always things you can do to improve your chances. And especially with Anakin, while this is a good list, it there's a lot of decision points. It is a lot harder to play well than some of the stuff we've had previously. So if you are familiar with how Anakin works and how Kiadi works and how Republic in general works, you can leverage some of those decision points to help your own chances. Knowing your enemy is really how you can get ahead of them. So we're basically going to go through a bunch of different tips on how to get those advantages. Is this going to hard counter them? No. Are you necessarily going to win every game? No. But it can make a bad matchup into a mediocre matchup, or a mediocre matchup into a good one. And most importantly, this is something that will allow you to go to your local game night, and that guy who's just been beating up on everybody week after week with this top tier meta list when everyone else has a core box and maybe 2 other boxes, it will give you some things to think about that isn't just, oh, I'll have to go buy the new big thing. You can kind of improve through gameplay rather than just, I gotta shell out money.
Yeah, I do think we are in a current meta of skill expression.
Uh-huh.
In a way that I at least did not feel existed in the previous one with some of the dominant lists, where there was some cases where there could be a fairly large skill gap and it's still a really rough matchup or rough mission choice. And I feel like we definitely have less of this, which shows a lot of credit to the rebalance.
Uh-huh.
So looking at this specifically, and because I had said this about Mandos previously when Armor came out, and Mandos are just such a high floor, and not the highest ceiling. I think Mandos are very, very good. I think there's a base level there, but whenever there's a conversation on what's the best counter for Mandos, they're everywhere. Tons of people are playing them. And my answer is good Shatterpoint. And because Mandos are just incredible all-comer list. I don't think there are necessarily hard counters to what they're doing. They are playing Shatterpoint well. And a lot of the pieces that Mandos bring do that. And Anakin is not that list. There are a lot of decision points. There are a lot of ways where you can choose the wrong thing to do, and making Anakin's activations difficult, I think, is the best counterplay. And a lot of different lists have tools to do that. A heavily conditioned Anakin isn't doing anything. Strains, pins, disarms can really stop what Anakin wants to do. Now, this list has some great ways to heal that, but you need to hit the points of healing that before Anakin's going to be able to go. Which, to the point that we talked about in our game, Anakin needs to stay in reserve till he hits the right point. And slowing down or delaying that Anakin activation can give you a really great opportunity to build some momentum.
And knowing when those important points are coming up, or even just knowing where he is in the order deck, is also useful for you as the opponent, because you know when to put those conditions on him. Kiadi-Mundi is great for taking conditions off of Anakin, but if that condition just got put on him, he can't do it outside of their own activation. Yeah, they can go wound something, but if you put a pin on Anakin when he's the only thing left in the deck, he can't go wound something before having to remove that pin.
And nothing else in the list can really reliably wound.
Yep. Kiadi-Mundi has pretty good attacks, but
he can spike, for sure.
But nothing is as reliable as an Anakin turn in terms of getting those wounds.
I think that's part of it, and Titus, you touched on this a bit, but you need to accept that Anakin's going to wound something. Full stop. You cannot stop that from happening. There are a very select handful of units in this game that Anakin will have a hard time wounding. Anakin's going to kill something. Oh, Titus, you mentioned in our game that you specifically sacrifice your supports. You put your supports on points that were the ones that Anakin could get to reasonably. And you made sure that those were the targets, because especially against your list, you're getting your Cassian revenge trigger when Anakin wounds something. He's not wounding, or he's not moving much other than Kiadi's identity when wounding a support. So you're cutting some of my movement, you're getting some of your own, and that can be a great counter. I think from a list perspective, I think revenge abilities do certainly help into Anakin. They're not the end all be all. This isn't, like playing into Iden where this will make a huge difference in your game plan. But you getting some reactive movement when Anakin's getting his movement can help balance out that board state.
So there's a lot of different reactives and passive abilities that are effective against Anakin, but it's all about knowing what the timing is. But they can absolutely be a lifeline if you know how to use them. So for movements that are kind of reactive and that trigger off of an attack, check the wording on it. If they trigger on the attack, that means you have an opportunity to allow a unit to flee from Anakin's second attack because you are the defending player and your attack triggers happen after Anakin's attack triggers, which generally means supporting fire dash, which is often what he's using to close that gap. Knowledge and defense, disciplined, and a lot of revenge triggers will happen after the supporting fire dash, but before Anakin can choose to use that second attack. That gives you a window to say, no, we're clearing out. You have no one in melee anymore. That is a very good way to counter him.
And denying Anakin the wound can really take the gas off. Yeah, conditioning Anakin up, I think, is a core one. You mentioned supporting fire there being a key way where Anakin stays engaged with targets and chases targets. Wounding the ARFs and making that cost something.
Yep.
Is a definite way to go to, again, just slow the list down. The other side of the list, the cam side, there's not much you can do to stop displacement, but there is a couple ways you can think about it. And I think just being mindful when you're placing your models on points of how can I get in a position where force pushing me off of here is going to be difficult. Take a look at the range of where Kiadi and Shakti can get to and what angle they'd have to push you, and try to backstop your model on terrain or those kind of things can really make a difference because, Kiadi and Shakti's movement is limited. It's a dash and an advance. So there's only so many positions they can get in to get that force push or that force repulse on you. Tactically placing your model in places where they're going to be more difficult to push or remove from a point can definitely be relevant. I know there's been some times where I made a choice to yes, I could get this model actually up on terrain on an objective, but I'm actually going to choose to put it below because I'm looking at Kiadi's range or Shakti's range, and that force push or force repulse here isn't that effective because I'm up against this building, and also they can't get up on the point from where they are. And just being mindful of that, and that's not always going to work if you're on more open terrain, if, again, this is very terrain dependent, but it, again, is just being mindful when you're taking objectives on what direction is that going to come from.
It's usually terrain dependent, but something you can do is place one of your own units, even if it's a wounded unit or something, behind the unit that is actually on the point. You can make an ad hoc backstop for yourself by just piling your own guys in there. It can be difficult to set that up, but sometimes it's worth it.
That'll take us into our next one, which I'll pass to you, Titus, and talk about Cassian, who's also running.
He's everywhere.
Having a bit of a run. Yeah.
So Cassian is something you're probably going to see a lot of, but he's also got very diverse options in terms of list building. It tends to fall into a few camps, but he can do pretty much anything. So when you are seeing a Cassian list there, be aware not just of what he does, but also what the list is bringing beside him. The two most common forms of a Cassian list that I've seen is revenge heavy lists that pile in other revenge triggers. That can be Ahsoka, it can be Princess Leia, it can be Han, but also secondaries that get revenge triggers like K2 or Bosk.
The most common I think we've seen from the revenge perspective is Cassian Rebels. This is either your Cassian Leia or Cassian Kanan.
Yeah, it's usually a rebel list. These ones are the lists where if you're facing it, you want to avoid wounding as much as possible, and if essentially you want to do as little damage as possible when you are capturing points. Don't just look at it when you are getting to the point where you might wound them, even early game. If you can pin, shove, and get someone off a point in 2 steps down your tree, you don't need to put that extra 3-4 damage after that onto them. The pin and the shove is all you need. Do that, because that will allow you to shove them again later without killing them. It is important to look for opportunities to wound something when the revenge won't matter, whether that's because Leia is out of range even with the advance, or because the struggle's about to flip, something like that. Getting those wounds will hurt Cassian because it's low force, but by and large, you're trying to avoid wounding. This is a control matchup, whether you are bringing a control list or not.
Yeah, and you want to time your wounds, right? There's no harm in setting up some wounds. Again, you can be in positions where I can't shoot this thing or I can't shove this thing because I'm going to wound it. But this is, again, looking at your board state. What can move, and is it worth taking the wound right now? And that is the trade-off you're looking for. Now, this list typically in the Rebels fashion will have a lot less for tiebreakers and lockdown. You might have your K2 or your Lobot for the lockdown. You might have Ezra in there for a tiebreaker. And in my mind, those are going to be your priority things to wound, because turning those off will make a pretty big difference into the impact you can make on the board state.
Now, the flip side would be the Cassian control lists, which typically focus more on leveraging Cassian's revenge trigger and some of his other aspects to his list. And especially leverage his amount of points he can bring to the list building to bring high value units, things that have those lockdowns, things that have those tiebreakers, anything that will make that movement more valuable. This list will want them. And this list is also one that really suffers from being wounded heavily. So when you're facing a Cassian control list with things like Moff Gideon and Lobot and that general style of high value units.
Again, this is something you've been playing, Titus, where you just shove as many tiebreakers and
exactly. Because it doesn't have any way of really punishing you besides positioning, you can wound them with relative impunity and make everything really expensive. You will likely lose struggle 1, and that is something you will have to be prepared for if that is the route you take to try to go full aggro on them, because they're the first few wounds, their positioning will really hurt you. But if you can get 4 or 5 wounds on them before the first struggle ends, it's going to make their next 2 struggles much harder, because Cassian, especially Cassian Moff, often will want to reserve something. That leaves them 4 force for their entire deck. And when things are wounded, they likely won't get to use any of their force abilities.
Yeah, and Titus, you and I talked about this during our game. That was the strategy I went into that game with. And I think we were really close to that breaking point.
Yes, we were. I had some lucky activations where things woke up shortly after being wounded, and that helped me out a lot. That's not always going to happen. You can still go the I don't want to wound anything route, but the control list is really counting on you making that decision, because, again, it has a lot of tiebreakers, it has a lot of lockdown units. So it benefits from you trying to out-control it, because it generally has a better hold on points than you do. So the wound, like the full aggro route, can be very risky, but it might turn out to be the best chance you have against this kind of list.
And you don't, again, in your Cassian Moff as an example, you don't have a ton of out of activation movement that isn't relying on Cassian. So I do think there's a part of that in an early struggle 1 where a really quick moving list can get an early advantage.
Yes.
I think of like a shifting matchup against something like Ewoks, or an Iden Veer style list where you can get a really good early advantage against this list.
Yeah, Iden Veers and Iden in general is something I would not want to run this list into. It's a good combination of that really fast open, but also will put more wounds on my list than I can handle. And I think Anakin Cam is another one that can do that route, although it's a little hard because they have to get into melee. But anything that can take that really aggressive route against a Cassian control list, I think it's worth the attempt. It might backfire on you, but
One thing I'll
I
call out for Cassian's revenge trigger is a lot of other revenge triggers like Kanan's, Mando's, Ahsoka's have a healing factor before the movement or the attack. Cassian's doesn't. So very simply, a pinned model cannot move on that route. So conditions can be a very effective strategy against Cassian. You know, I'm thinking the 212th for Republic and being able to just hand out a bunch of pins. Honestly, a stormtrooper strategy with Empire, where everything's got that pin on that expertise. I think if you can just hand out a lot of those pins, where that tiebreaker unit or that lockdown unit is just pinned, you can just start wounding whenever you.
If you have pins on the trees, which a lot of supports do, can, rather than focusing fire like we are very much incentivized to do in a lot of matchups, you can split your fire because, well, you know, I have a shot left. I don't necessarily need to push anything. That guy over there isn't doing anything. Let's take a shot at him and try to get a pin on there just because. It can very much help your chances to just put conditions on everything.
100%. Honestly, I'm in my head thinking like something like a Krennic with some stormtroopers, those extra 5 dice attacks, getting some more pins spread out. There's a lot of options here. And don't get me wrong, Cassian's very good. And again, the mental tax of anything could move if I wound something is a lot. But there are definitely plans you can go in, and I think there's answers across the board. Again, so we're not talking specific lists. I think a lot of factions and units have the tools to be able to play into these lists.
One thing I will say in terms of the conditions, and it's something we've mentioned on the cast before, be careful with strains, because you are giving the Cassian list a way to kill their own units, which can give them movement. Obviously, it's still good for you if they wound their own units.
But I've seen you do it.
Yep, but sometimes it is just another option for their tool belt.
Yeah, so the next kind of list style, without less specific as to the Anakin and Cassian stuff running around. We touched on Rebel Revenge there a bit, which I think are going to involve Cassian more often than not. But we also have some attrition style lists that it's important to keep an eye out for in the meta. Iden, who we've mentioned a couple times, who is, not the list that it once was, but is still exceptionally viable. Iden hasn't been changed at all, and she absolutely still hits like a truck. So we see, whether she's paired with Grand Inquisitor or Vader, this can be an all-in wound style list. That again, this is where, so Titus, what are you doing into an attrition style list? Obviously, revenge triggers are good.
So I haven't really played into Iden in specific since the change, but one thing that I was careful to do was keep my supports back, because unless they're an attrition list that goes, oh, I want to kill primaries for X and Y reason, whether it's Anakin or Asajj or something CT, if it's just a list that wants to kill things and doesn't care what it is, your supports are the most vulnerable units, and keeping them back can be useful, especially against something that has infiltrate and can get across the board really quickly. You might even just deploy them a little further back than you usually would. If you have infiltrate units of your own, you might not send them up a full 3 towards the midline.
Especially on a mission where you don't have to.
Exactly.
One attrition style list that I think we're going to see a lot of, and you've played a bit of, is anything around CAD and IG-88.
The bounty hunters can roll a lot of dice.
I think, Titus, that one game against Sean, how many wounds did you have?
I had 11, and I had 3 of his units off the table by the end of the game.
And that is not something I've ever seen in Shatterpoint. Even Iden at height of misery, that is an absurd amount of wounds.
And part of that was just, it was a very long game. I wouldn't expect that to happen a lot, but
no,
it can happen.
But CAD's got a few pairings you can take with this IG-88 list and filled with bounty hunters or things with payday. I know Ryan's been playing a lot of CAD Mando with both IGs, which I've seen enough of to know that it can throw out a whole lot of wounds.
Yep. The thing with the bounty hunters and scoundrels in general, I find, they aren't very mobile. Their own activation can often be very fast. IG-11 comes to mind. He can attack twice and
most of the bounty hunters have
attacks.
most of the bounty hunters have a tactic dash they get for free.
So their own turn can be very mobile, but they don't move out of activation very much. And that's something you can very much leverage against these attrition scoundrels or attrition bounty hunter lists, is just try to outmaneuver them. And obviously, again, pins are the order of the day here, because pins seem to hurt the less mobile units a lot more than the more mobile ones. And it's not a list that can handle that very well.
Yeah, and the list that counters like that helps them with that the most is Cassian. Adding that revenge movement, you've got 2 9-point primaries. Playing with 4 force, but allow that open list building. It allows you to take IG-88 on one side and Han and Chewie on the other. Whether you're playing Rebel Commandos or Bounty Hunters, whether you're playing Han and Chewie or IG-11, those are all great options. This is a very versatile list, because I've also seen the secondary can be Boosh or Dengar. Zion's Crew did a really great episode about this that came out last week. If you want to know more about the Cassian list, I'd really recommend checking it out. But in terms of playing against it, Titus, how do you go about playing against a list like that?
So I would reiterate that wounding it is a very good way to deal with that. Just put a lot of wounds on them, especially IG-88. Because when it starts off, IG-88's ability to give extra dice is force neutral, or even it can be a force benefit, because you're adding dice for 1 force, but you're getting back 2 on a kill. Once he's wounded, that becomes much, much worse, because you're spending 2 force to get extra dice, and your best case scenario is you wound something and you get 2 force back. So you haven't gained anything. But if they whiff, they're out 2 force. And that can escalate really quickly, because they almost always want those extra dice.
Wound priority. I agree. IG-88 is certainly top there.
Even if you're not doing an attrition list, even if you're not going aggro, wounding IG-88 will exponentially increase your chances of coming out of that game the winner.
Yeah, I think the supports would be the next priority, and whether that's Rebel Commandos, Han and Chewie, less so IG-8 or IG-11, but Rebel Commandos and Han and Chewie both will also just kind of pay a price for,
or bounty hunters if they're taking the bounty hunters.
The other thing is, again, and this is partially in the list building phase, but things like revenge triggers will go a long way. Being able to punish those wounds, anything with defensive tech. And this kind of goes into another archetype that we had on here, which was Republic tough things. So this is things like Kenobi, Mace, Ahsoka Jedi No More, who is both tough and comes with a revenge trigger.
Empire has its own version where it's the all protection lists.
The all protection Empire is really, really tough to chew through. Protection is a really great one, because a lot of those bounty hunters do have a ceiling to their trees when it comes to damage output. So if you're able to have units that just kind of break over those ceilings, things that have above 9 health, things that have protection can go a long way. Because if they're not able to close that wound and you're able to deny the force regen, that list gets tight.
I think we had another category we wanted to talk about, which was the all-comer lists. I know you mentioned that with the Mandos earlier, but it is something we will be running into between the Mandos, and I would also consider the Ewoks to be that. You definitely have some rebel lists that lean more into that side than the revenge.
Yeah, things with
ones.
Luke, Han, that kind of stuff. Fulcrum, I think, is another one. Even in Republic, when you're talking like hunter style lists, again, you're just taking stuff that's solid units, good at the game, and you're playing a game plan that's just meant to move, hold points, shove things. This is just good Shatterpoint lists. And again, I definitely Mandos, Ewoks. I would 100% agree there. So, and I think this is going to simply come down to the answer I gave earlier. The answer to playing into these lists is good Shatterpoint. They're all comers lists for a reason, which is that they don't have hard counters, really. They have solid movement. They have tough bodies. They are generally just able to play Shatterpoint very well. And this comes into, I think, less about knowing how to play against them and more so into being an expert at the list you brought.
Yep.
Know what your list is good at and play into it. If you fall into one of the other archetypes that we've kind of talked about here, lean into that play style, and that is really going to be your best bet against these styles of lists. If you're leaning that Republic tough things where you're leaning on Kenobi and playing Mace or Ahsoka or Cam, your reps in that list will dictate how well you can handle these all-comers matchups, because they're going to be fast moving, they're going to have good recovery, they're going to have different ways to solve different problems. Again, they're typically going to be through decent damage, through shoves on trees. These aren't big trick lists. There isn't something they're really leaning into, and they're able to be flexible in their approach. Yep. But knowing your list, knowing what it's good at, and practicing with it is really the best counter into a lot of lists.
Yep. And I would say the other thing I would want to focus on against these guys is positioning. You want to make sure that because they are generally faster than you want to make sure your positioning is enabling you to switch between points when you need to, keeping not necessarily standing directly on the point, but kind of leaning out a little bit. I mean, it's like if anybody watches baseball, the players will edge their way out to the next base in preparation. You're doing kind of the same thing with your units. They're on the point, but they're getting ready for the next movement they need to take.
Yeah, especially if you're playing something with Cassian that's going to be handing out advances or repositions. Yes. You want to place things in positions where they're going to be able to get to a different objective. If you're playing on sabotage, being conscious of putting your model in a place where a dash can get it to another objective, versus a place like if you're standing directly on an objective, a dash is not going to get you to another point in and out of activation. But if you're standing, within 2, you're holding that objective, but you're facing more to the inside of the board, there might be a couple points that you can, get a quick move over to, and planning those out and thinking about those. And Titus, I'll give you credit here. This is something that you are very good at. You are very conscious on where you leave models for when and if they get to move. It's going to be to somewhere relevant.
Well, I think that takes us to the end of this discussion.
I would hope
obviously, we could go on for hours about different little tips and tricks that you can bring to the table, but this is, we want to keep it to mostly a broad spectrum sort of, a zoomed out approach to things. So,
yeah.
But
what I will say confidently is the meta that we're in right now, nothing feels unbeatable. Nothing feels unwinnable. And that is a great state to be in. I think we're still seeing things settle out. A couple of the pieces we've talked about today are very good, but I think there's a lot of tools out there for dealing with the good stuff. Right?
And especially because these lists, while they are good, can also be very difficult to play. So unless you're going against the world champion or something, people are going to make mistakes. And even if you are going against the world champion, they'll make mistakes. So it's never a lost cause. You always have to play to your outs. But if anybody has their own tips and tricks that they would like to share, check out our Discord. I believe it's in the show notes.
Always is.
And we will likely be having discussions about that for the foreseeable future, because I don't see these lists going away.
100%. So if you've got your own lists, your own tactics, drop that in the Discord. Thank you for hanging out with us for this conversation, and I'm sure Sean will be back with us next week.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Have a good night.